All right, so we are concluding the BRICS summit that obviously took place over the past 3 days, and we've seen quite a number of issues topping the agenda with various heads of state and dignitaries, as well as guests being invited to be part of the various discussions that happened. BRICS heads of state now also having announced during the briefing earlier on that they will be expanding the bloc by addition of 6 more countries. So there's obviously now going to be 11 countries making up at this point. BRICS heads of state also have expanded the membership of the economic bloc to include oil-rich countries such as Saudi Arabia, even Iran and the United Arab Emirates. So there's lots of developments unfolding. We're going to now also keep with our BRICS coverage. SABC International News Editor Sophie Mokoena is in conversation with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. It's across live chat at the Sandton Convention Centre.
Well, we are here at the Sandton Convention Centre. As you heard earlier on, the UN chief spoke to the media, but earlier on he spoke to the leaders. These leaders are from different countries on the continent and the South, and also different regional organizations. It was a huge platform to communicate different issues. SG, good afternoon and
good afternoon.
Welcome to my country, South Africa, a beautiful country.
It is a beautiful country and it is a lesson for us all. My first visit to South Africa was during the transition. I came to see Nelson Mandela when I was co-chair of the African Committee of the Socialist International. And from then on, I've been accompanying South Africa with a lot of interests. And you represent, in a world where unfortunately so many divisions exist, a symbol of unity in diversity that I want to underline.
SG, let's talk about the divisions. When you spoke to the leaders, you spoke about multipolar world, good, but you have to manage this well in terms of not using this transition or those changes in terms of dividing the world further. But it is what it is. It looks like the world is drifting apart.
Well, we are facing enormous challenges. We have climate change, a defining issue of our time, and we see the devastation that is already causing, and we see that it is moving out of control. We have a cost of living crisis all over the world, a dramatic increase in poverty, in hunger and inequalities. And we have technological developments that nobody is able to control. I mean, countries and international organizations are unequipped, both legally and technically, to deal with some of the developments that we see in artificial intelligence that have many positive aspects, but also many threats to our common future. Now, with these challenges, it's dramatic that the world is so divided, and it is essential to bridge these gaps and these divisions. Now, the world is becoming multipolar, and that is a good thing. But the experience of the past shows that multipolarity is not enough. You need to have some global governance institutions, multilateral institutions, to be able to bring together the international community in addressing these challenges. Now, for that, we need to rebuild trust. And indeed, we are in a low moment of trust, and the war in Ukraine is a factor that complicates it enormously. But one reason more for us to persist, and one reason more for us to explain that if South Africa was able, after apartheid and after what has happened in the past, South Africa was able to create a united society, we must be able to create a united world to face the challenges that are now threatening our future.
You spoke about climate change. The Paris Agreement, those agreements were not honored by the developed world, particularly your industrialized nations like your G7 and moving to the G20. Why the developed North is not honoring the agreements? Because the developing South, they are looking up to the developed countries to to take them on board?
Now, I said once again today, it's absolutely essential that developed countries are able to match their commitments. Commitment of $100 billion per year for developing countries, the commitment of doubling the financial support to adaptation. I mean, we see dramatic impacts already in place, and we need to invest in the resilience of communities and infrastructure. That's what it's called, adaptation, and that requires much more financing, and there was a promise of doubling. It needs to be materialized. We managed to have a big victory in Cairo with the creation of the loss and damage fund, but now it needs to be operationalized, and we need to replenish the Green Climate Fund. So these things are the minimum that needs to be done. But then there is more, and we have asked for what we called a global climate solidarity pact. All emerging economies must come together, and developing ones supporting developing emerging economies in order to effectively being able together to reduce emissions. There was a positive step that was done with the Just Energy Transition Agreements, one in South Africa, one in Vietnam, one in Indonesia. There was a recent similar agreement in Senegal, but it's too little. We need to have a real, I mean, there are common but differentiated responsibilities according to the capacities of different countries. That's why we are asking developed countries to reduce more quickly emissions than developing countries, but everybody must do an extra effort, and there must be a strong support from the developed world to the developing world for the developing world to be able to do it.
You spoke about the Loss and Damage Fund, the agreement in Sharm el-Sheikh, and are you confident that going to the United Arab Emirates, the COP28, we are going to see the implementation thereof?
I can tell you, these must be done. And the frustration that would come out of a failure of these is such that I believe that the member states will come together on a solution.
Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has affected, again, developing countries and poorer nations. You have spearheaded what is known as the Black Sea Grain Deal. Unfortunately, the Russian Federation has taken a decision not to honor or to renew the agreement. And the argument of President Vladimir Putin is that in terms of those agreements, in relation to Russia got nothing, but also the grain went to the developed countries, while the developing countries and poorer countries, Africa in particular, got a small percentage. You are in this pot. You know better in terms of reports. What is your message to the Russian Federation?
Well, first of all, a lot of things were done to facilitate the exports of Russian food and fertilizers. There are still problems that were not yet solved, but a lot of things have already been done. And we were working, and we are working to solve the remaining ones. And the fact that the initiative was interrupted doesn't help us in those efforts. And so my message is, let's work together to see if this can be solved. Second, the truth is that you need to distinguish, first of all, what is for animal feed from what is for human feed. Yes. Globally, developing countries had a share slightly larger than developed countries, but in human feed that difference is even bigger. The fact is that in these developing countries, you have, because this was done through the mechanisms that exist, you have many countries that are middle-income countries that are there, and indeed the percentage for the least developed countries was relatively reduced, as it is in all markets for all purposes. And that is the reason why we involved the World Food Programme in this action. And the World Food Programme had meaningful support to Yemen, to Somalia, to other countries in the same situation, exactly to compensate the fact that the natural operation of the market is not favorable to the countries with less dimension, less capacity, less resources. But there is one thing that's important to underline. When the operation took place, prices came down. And when prices come down, they come down to everybody and to all kinds of operations.
The whole world.
So the benefit was for everybody, including those that were not receiving those grains. So it is not true that the least developed countries did not beneficiate from the Black Sea Grain Initiative.
There's a criticism that this war in Ukraine exposed the weaknesses of the United Nations, including the Security Council. And this institution, when it was formed after the World War II, the intention was to maintain world peace and unite the globe. What is your response to the criticism that the UN it is at its weakest moment?
The UN are many things. The UN are the humanitarian agencies that have not been as active as they are now and as important as they are now to rescue people everywhere. The UN is the work done by our peacekeepers in very dramatic circumstances. The UN is many things. It's not only the Security Council. It has a General Assembly, it has the Human Rights Council. But it is true that the Security Council has been blocked in relation to most of the more dramatic crises that we face. And this is one of the reasons why I've said today, as I've repeated in many other occasions, we have institutions that were created out of the Second World War. The world has changed. So the Security Council, as the Bretton Woods institutions, reflect the world of 45. And they need to be reformed. And Africa is particularly important on this because the African countries were not, I mean, a few were. Ethiopia was there, Egypt was there, but most of the African countries were not yet free from the colonial powers. And so they were not there where these institutions were created. And the most obvious injustice in the Security Council is that there is not one single permanent member of the African continent. The good news is that I believe that for the first time this year, I saw everybody recognizing this, including the permanent 5 members, that this problem needs to be solved. It's probably be complicated, but it needs. So I think there is a growing conscience that both in relation to the Security Council and in relation to the Bretton Woods institution, we need to transform them, to adapt them to what the world is today. The power relations of today, the economy of today, which is very different from what it was in 1945.
The SG Peace and Security, just spoken about the challenges of peace and security. We have a problem on the continent, Sudan, Libya, the DRC, now Niger. Your observation, why are we back where we see so many coups on the continent?
I think that we have a situation in which terrorist groups have emerged and they are more and more powerful. And I've been insisting on the need for the international community to recognize that it is important to have peace enforcing and counter-terrorism operations done by robust African forces, but with a mandate from the Security Council and with guaranteed funding from so-called assessed or mandatory contributions. I've been saying that this is needed. The fact is that this has not happened until now, and we see growing insecurity. And when we see growing insecurity, then you need to find scapegoats. And unfortunately, one of the scapegoats that we are witnessing is the existence of democratic institutions in themselves. And so we see this absurd thing, which is the military that should be fighting the terrorists, are not very effective in fighting the terrorism.
They want power.
They want power. And in my opinion, we need to address the root causes of this situation. And to address the root cause of this situation is to invest in robust African capacity to address its security risks, not to give this kind of pretext to those that, instead of doing their job, are trying to grab power for whatever purposes.
Finally, SG, you are going to Kenya. You are going to the G20 in India. You'll be at the G77 plus China in Cuba. And then you have the UN General Assembly. And on the margins, you have this climate summit. And of course, the climate summit in the United Arab Emirates. All these important engagements from different regions. What will be one strong message at a time where the economy of the globe is very sluggish? You called for a compact when you were addressing the Nelson Mandela lecture during the COVID-19. But what we saw was hoarding of vaccines.
Well, I think we need to have two complementary things. One is an immediate action plan. That's why we have proposed the so-called SDG stimulus involving the injection of $500 billion in the developing countries to be able to respond to the dramatic situation they face now with that, and to the need to invest in their youth, to create jobs, and to be able to address the challenges of climate change. And other aspects that need to be done in relation to debt relief mechanisms, change of model of multilateral development banks, and the way they need to be much more effective in mobilizing private finance at reasonable cost to developing countries. So there are a number of things that can be done immediately. And then we need to think about what are the reforms that are necessary for multilateralism to be able to provide what it needs to provide to the world. And that is why I'm so much insisting on the need to look seriously into the reforms of the Security Council, of the Bretton Woods system, and the different other international institutions, and reforming also many of the mechanisms that we have today, and increasing the capacity of both countries and multilateral organizations to be able to deal with those aspects that unfortunately we are not controlling today. One is climate, and the other is the development of certain technologies that, if not properly regulated, can become a big threat for all of us.
Thank you so much, SG.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you, sir. That was the UN chief speaking to us here at the Sandton Convention Centre on the margins of the BRICS summit. He has been very consistent. The message from the G7 is the message he's communicated here. And it looks like in Kenya, it will be the same message. At the G20, it will be the same message. G77 plus China in Cuba, it will be the same message. And of course, at the United Nations General Assembly, it will be the same message. But the big question is there a political will in relation to world leaders to listen to what the Secretary General is saying? Or are the leaders all about themselves to an extent that the world can suffer and finally all of us almost perish because we don't want to do what is right for the globe, not what is right for the leaders. Back to you, Johannesburg in studio.